Let's give this sample repo a try. To do that, we'll need to start with the URL. Then we can go to our terminal and clone it to our local file system, and then open it in VS Code. Now, while VS Code is loading, we take a look at the Babashka configuration file. That's the bb.eden. This is the only extra thing you need in your project to run Babashka tasks. The README tells us to try a few things from this Babashka file, so let's start with the first suggestion from the README, and that is to run bb tasks, to list the tasks that are available. So we'll run that in our terminal, and we can see all the tasks that are configured in that config file, in that bb.eden. The README then suggests that we run this read-only task which lists all our scratch orgs. So let's try that. And we get back a colorized list of tasks. So how does that work? Let's look at the config file, and we can find that task, the scratch org list. You can see its docstring there, and then the Clojure code which is being run. All it's doing is generating a CLI command, but then it's checking the response for a good status, and it'll throw and block if it's not a good status, and if it gets past that, it will reshape the result into a colored list. The README then suggests that we try a more sophisticated task, create and deploy an open org. So let's run that, and it immediately tells us that we are missing an argument. So this task has been configured to depend on a previous task called parse arguments, and that is a configurable way of defining arguments that you want to use in any other task. So if we provide that, then that task will pass, and it'll then run the full sequence of tasks that we want when we want to create an org, deploy code, open it, all that kind of stuff. So while that's running, let's look at how this works. We start this by running the last task in a chain. That last task is create and open org. But that task depends on a prior task called deploy app. And if we look at the deploy app task, it depends on check install package, which depends on install package, which depends on create scratch org. So there's a reverse chain of dependencies, and when you run any task, Babashka will run the tasks in dependency order. In any individual task itself is just Clojure code, and you can see here this is the create task, which is now completed, and you can see the output from that task is in purple because that task result is also being colorized printed. The subsequent task after the create org looks like it's an install package, and now check install package, which is a polling loop for the prior command. So the install package command, you can see, runs. This is the polling loop command here, but it is actually polling using the ID from the previous task. You can see that at line 55 or 56, where the ID of the install result is being referenced in the check polling loop. Then, as you can see now, we're deploying the app code. That's a following task, and then finally open the org, and that is the final task in this chain. So that is an example of a much more complex and real-world requirement where we would define tasks and maybe have results from tasks stored so that subsequent tasks can use them. Next, let's explore what it's like to create code for these tasks. How does Clojure help us, and how does a Clojure REPL help us make it easier for us to create these tasks? To do this, we'll need Clojure support in VS Code, so we'll need an extension installed called Calva. Once you have Calva installed, you can use the command palette to start a Clojure REPL. So that's the command here, and we want the Babashka flavor, which gives us fast startup. Once that's running, we can now start sending code to the REPL. So this require brings in the library of task utilities that Nextdoc provides. Then we can start evaluating forms. So here is a form which runs the envlisk command, and we're going to evaluate it using the command palette. You can see the results come back, and those results are being stored in a local variable called listResult. And now we can evaluate that form, that value, without rerunning the command. So we can play with it and get instant feedback. So here we're taking the listResult, lifting the scratch.org's list out of it, and then grabbing the aliases out of there. Now, if you look at the result, it's got nested arrays in it. So we're going to lift the first version out of each array, and then convert the higher level list into what we call a vector, which is the square brackets instead of the round brackets. So that shows you how fast you can iterate with the results of tasks and even run tasks that depend on each other or prior results. So here's another one, another simple one. This one's showing how to create, which is your current scratch.org, your default scratch.org. Now this one here shows the 2 steps required to install a package. The first step starts the install and stores the result in a value called install result, and that's running now. And now we have a value called install result, which we can evaluate and get instant results with. But we can then use it in the subsequent task. You can see here we can evaluate getting just the ID out of it. But what we really want to do is use that ID to run the polling command. So this is the same thing we saw when we were running it from the command line, but now we're just running it from the REPL, and we can experiment and play with the results to get really fast feedback. But you get the same type of result. Once you've finished and you've got your commands right, your tasks right, then you can just copy this code directly straight into the BB Eden. And that's exactly how this has been done, including defining local values which are then used by subsequent tasks. Finally, let's take a quick tour of the Babashka Eden file. First of all, the minimum version, that specifies the version of Babashka that provides task runner support. The paths includes a path to the fiddle file. That's so that the REPL can load it, so that was only necessary for REPLs. The deps are dependencies. These are libraries pulled in from GitHub. We don't need Maven or NPM. We can just directly use GitHub. zprint is for color printing, and Salesforce Babashka is from Nextdoc for running and checking the results of Salesforce CLI commands. The tasks themselves, that's tasks there is pulling in the code for pretty printing and Salesforce commands. And then the enter and leave entries is code that is wrapped around each individual task. So before each task runs, even if multiple tasks are being run in a chain, these 2 bits of code will run. So for example, if I run the scratch.org list command in my terminal, as we did before, you'll see that, we need BB to run that. If we run it, you'll see that we print starting and finished wrapped around that command. So you can put any code you like in there. And what about the tasks themselves? Well, they are documentation strings and then a task, a bit of Clojure code. That code is exactly the same code you saw in the REPL when we were running the fiddle code. You just copy and paste it once you have it working in the REPL into the Babashka config file, and then it becomes a named task you can run from the command line. Here's an example of a really simple one where we want to just open the org with no dependent tasks, something you would do a lot, and it, as you can see, just runs the CLI command to open the org. So that's the whirlwind tour of this sample repo. Hopefully it gives you a sense of getting started with this kind of tooling, and we hope you find it useful.